Welcome to the Department Chair Leadership Podcast, where the goal is to improve organizations and serve students one leader at a time. I'm your host, Dr. Chris Jochum. If you're a department chair in higher education or any type of educational leader, and you want to improve yourself to better serve and influence those you lead, you've come to the right place. Because the best way to improve an organization is to improve its leader. Let's get started. Welcome back, friends, and thank you for taking some time to invest in yourself and those you serve by focusing on your leadership development. Hey, before we get into today's episode with Dr. Ed Martini, which you will not want to miss, I just want to remind you of a great professional development opportunity coming up February 7th through 9th, 2024 in Indianapolis. It's the Academic Chairpersons Conference, and I can't think of a single event that has contributed more to my development as a chair and leader than this conference. And also, as a member of the advisory board, I can tell you that we have a great lineup of presentations, workshops, and invited speakers. So there's still time to register. Check out the show notes for the links. Today, we are joined by Dr. Edwin Martini, who currently serves as the Provost and Vice Chancellor for Academic Affairs at the University of Wisconsin Oshkosh, where he also holds an appointment as Professor of History. Prior to joining UWO in July of this year, Ed spent 18 years at Western Michigan University in Kalamazoo, Michigan, where he held a series of progressive leadership positions, including Associate Dean, Associate Provost, and most recently, Vice Provost for Teaching and Learning and the founding Dean of Mers Tate College. He is also the author and editor of several books, including Invisible Enemies, The American War on Vietnam, 1975 to 2000, Agent Orange, History, Science, and the Politics of Uncertainty, and At War, The Military and American Culture in the 20th Century and Beyond. Martini also serves as co-editor of the University of Massachusetts Press book series, Culture and Politics in the Cold War and Beyond. So, again, we have some great leadership advice and insight from Dr. Edwin Martini. So you're going to want to take some notes on this, and just really hope you enjoy this episode. So on today's podcast, we are so fortunate to be joined by Dr. Edwin Martini, Provost and Vice Chancellor for Academic Affairs at the University of Wisconsin Oshkosh. Dr. Martini started his position last July after serving as the Vice Provost for Teaching and Learning at Western Michigan University. He also has a wealth of experience in other leadership roles and as an accomplished teacher and scholar. So, Dr. Martini, welcome to the Department Chair Leadership Podcast. So glad you're here.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me, Chris. I'm looking forward to it.
So I just wanted to start here. You, as I said, have served at many different leadership positions, different universities, 2 different universities. You just started in your current role. In addition to that, though, so people that are wondering, who are you? Can you tell us just a little bit about your leadership journey and how you arrived in your current position?
Sure. I hear from other, deans and provosts and folks all the time about they accidentally got involved in administration and suddenly found themselves as a chair or a dean. And that was never the case for me. I was always somebody who thought that I would have kind of an administrative path down the road as an undergrad, and as a grad student, I was the kind of person who volunteered for committees and wanted to find out how colleges and universities worked. I've never really worked outside of higher ed, don't know how to do anything else. So I've always been kind of interested in how these places work. And so, after finishing grad school, when I went out and got my first tenure track job, I was excited to be a faculty member and really dove into that work and teaching and publishing and had grad students and loved all that. But I got to the point where I was ready for that next challenge and to kind of return to some of that administrative work. And so I was at Western Michigan University at the time, and initially had a fairly kind of traditional path. I became associate chair of our Department of History and had planned on becoming chair and then, going from there. But as it turned out, an associate dean position came open in our College of Arts and Sciences. And got kind of recruited for that, and so started doing that work. Had a little bit of a detour back to faculty as we had some administrative upheaval at the university. But found another role at the university, kind of in our extended and online division, which I thought of at the time as maybe a short-term journey where I would learn more about online and continuing ed, but it ended up being a longer-term position where I ended up becoming associate provost of that unit, led a major restructuring of that unit during the pandemic, and that became vice provost. And then also during the pandemic, got asked to take on an additional role at the time as dean of Mers Tate College, which was a new college that we created at Western, kind of a university college model, but built around the concept of student success. So kind of did both of those jobs for about 3 years, and then began thinking it might be time to explore the world of provost, which seemed next. And only applied for a couple jobs and found the University of Wisconsin Oshkosh, and it seemed like a really good fit on both ends. And so I packed up and we moved our family here this summer, and I just started in July, and we have hit the ground running here. So I'm still very much learning the ropes here.
So thank you for that introduction. Certainly very somewhat maybe circuitous route. And you said, like many leaders that I think a lot of us have talked to, don't necessarily start out day one as a faculty member saying, I want to be a chair, a dean, a provost, but probably along the way realized, as you said, had a knack for it, were probably naturally intuitive, had a need to serve the university, could see that you would have some influence from that level. I want to jump in and I have some standard questions, but because you mentioned it, and I think it's very important, you said you had opportunity to develop a new college. What are some, I'm sure you could write a book on that. What are some things that you learned maybe about yourself or in terms of leadership when we do have to set out, have the, I guess, the fortune to get to develop new programs or even buildings? And I know you've done that as well. So what are some things you want to share about that from a leadership perspective?
Sure, great question. So it was a great opportunity. It was one of the signature initiatives of our then provost at WMU, and she wanted to move us towards a university college model, and had been doing all this great design work, and there was some excitement around it. And then the pandemic hit, and things just really stalled out, and she wasn't sure she had the right people in the right places, and so there had always been the plan to go find the right, dean to lead this thing forward. And at one point, I pitched her on a pretty crazy idea, which was let me do it in addition to this work that I'm doing over here in my teaching and learning unit. And eventually, she decided that it wasn't quite so crazy and allowed me to take charge of it. So it was really fun. And I think part of the lesson there was a lot of times it's about the right person at the right time for the right task. And so what we needed at that position, I think right then at Western, was we were bringing together people from different divisions and bringing over student affairs and academic affairs and things that had been housed in colleges and trying to functionally centralize some things. And we were doing so in the middle of the pandemic. We were all still remote. And so we bringing in somebody from outside just didn't make any sense at that point. We really needed somebody we believed who knew the players, who had relationships across campus and could kind of lean on those, who had some trust built up already, to come in and bring people together and do some team building, in a virtual environment and a challenging environment. We had just done some layoffs because of budget cuts. So, I mean, it was challenging, but I knew a lot of the people involved and was able to take the time to get to know some of the newer folks. And I think we built a great team because at the end of the day, it was about the people and making sure the people were in the right place so that we could ultimately serve the students. The flip side of that, which maybe we can talk about later, is, it became clear quickly that what we needed at UWO right now was probably someone coming in from the outside. Who, we are in the midst of making some major changes here, dealing with some major budget challenges in the state of Wisconsin and some other things. And so, again, kind of finding the right opportunity at the right time and making sure that you as a leader are the right fit for the job that needs to be done. I think that was certainly one of the big takeaways.
Well, Ed, I think since you mentioned it, I think that's very, very applicable to even chairs, those that are considering it. Maybe they're new, maybe they're on the market. And now, as someone as a provost who you hire deans,
Hmm.
assistant deans, chairs, maybe talk a little bit about the. I don't think there's pros and cons every time a position opens, and as you have found, there sometimes you need somebody that has more maybe institutional knowledge.
Yeah.
Other times, it doesn't mean that those that are maybe internal candidates are not prepared, but sometimes because of the political nature of the state, etc., you do need a fresh set of eyes. And so, what have you found? Because it sounds like you have uniquely served as both a longstanding interim candidate. You worked as a professor at Western Michigan, moved up the leadership ranks there, which is a great attribute to how they viewed you as a colleague. But then you also took a provost job at an institution that you had not worked at. So, what are some things that you might share with those in what I call middle level management in higher ed, chairs and directors, when they're either looking at that or maybe they don't get a job and they don't need to take it personally, but what are some of your thoughts along those lines?
Yeah. So I guess I would start with the idea that, for anybody who aspires to certainly being a dean or a provost or something like that, there's going to likely come a time in your career where you're going to need to really consider and probably make that jump, even if you've been at a place for 10, 15, 20 years. And I'd been there for 18. The likelihood of finding the chair job, the associate dean, the provost, or the presidency all at one place, I mean, that just doesn't happen very much anymore. It's pretty rare. So you got to think, I think, first about, when is it right for you? If you have a family with you, when is it right for you, and can make that work? Because if you can't make it work personally, it's never going to work professionally. So for us, a lot of conversations with my wife and our kids about what it might look like. We had raised kids in Kalamazoo. We had been there the whole time, for almost 2 decades. So we had to make sure that that possibility was right for us. And then certainly during the interviewing process, having some sense of what you're looking for and making sure that it is, as best as you can determine, the right fit. As an institution, as a job, just making sure it's the right fit for the right situation and the right point in your leadership journey. And I guess the other thing I would add is sometimes it's about, and a wise mentor once told me this when I was thinking about stepping into administration at Western, is that, you don't always get the job, obviously, but, when you raise your hand and say, I'm interested in doing this, that puts you on people's radar screens. So I had initially applied for another administrative job. I was a finalist for it, but didn't get it and was devastated at the time because I was confident I was going to get it. I was like, I'm great. I could totally do this job. And it absolutely was not the right job. It was absolutely not the right fit. But in doing that, I caught the attention of another administrator who, when they had a position open up, said, hey, that guy that applied for that other job, let's go back and talk with him a little bit too. So I think people, there's a point in both of those steps when you got to summon kind of the will and the courage to raise your hand, to take that leap, to leave the nest and say, I'm gonna put myself out there. And that, demands a little bit of vulnerability, a little bit of courage, but ultimately brings with it the rewards of finding the right next challenge.
Great advice. Just as an aside, I have so much respect for anyone that is an internal candidate for a high profile or leadership job. It takes so much courage to put yourself out there. In one hand, people know you, you know them, but in many ways they don't. Maybe from the leadership perspective, and I've often thought that just takes a lot of courage. Speaking of that, in addition to mentioning courage, you said vulnerability. A key part of my leadership philosophy, and this has influenced a lot of our listeners, and maybe you familiar with the work of Brene Brown. She's done some great work on courage, vulnerability. I say vulnerability is, in many ways, a leader's superpower because people are going to see our weaknesses, whether we admit it or not. And to what extent, and feel free to disagree, but to what extent, how do you feel about that statement about the need for leaders to be vulnerable?
I think it's critical, but I will also say that I did not always believe that to be true. When I was fairly junior in my career when I became associate chair, when I became associate dean, and so I absolutely thought I had to prove myself, and I was going to have all the answers, and needed to kind of fit the profile of what I thought people were expecting to see. And boy, was I wrong. If the pandemic and other things haven't taught us, that it's okay to be vulnerable, that it's okay to kind of say, hey, we don't have all the answers. We're dealing with some unprecedented stuff right now. And to put that out there, and to also then model that, for your team, for your direct reports, whether you're a department chair, a dean, or a provost, people are going to look to you for what's okay. And if you're putting up the shell and keeping people at a distance and trying to act tough and pretending to have answers that you don't, you're not serving yourself, but you're also not, instilling the value that you probably want in your team or your department or whatever it is. So I believe that. I think Brene Brown's work is right on point. And I think more and more people are becoming open to that concept, which I think is a great tool. And it doesn't come easy for all of us. It can be very gendered, of course, right? It can be challenging for those of us who present as male to be vulnerable, and it can also be a double-edged sword for female leaders who are then seen as being soft or they're not tough enough. I mean, so it's dicey territory, but the more of us who are willing to kind of accept that and put it out there and talk about it, I think benefits us all.
I'm glad you mentioned that, because I think so many people probably that are listening need to hear that. I think all of us, when we started whatever our first, I call it our titled leadership position, because I think anyone that works certainly in an educational system, be it higher ed, K-12, if you're serving students, you are a leader. So I always like to say our first formal or titled position, but I think that is common to think that we need to fit the role. And maybe some of us, based upon our backgrounds, think that needs to be more of a heavy-handed drill sergeant type of person. Because of that, and you've touched on this. So how would you define how do you define leadership? What's your leadership philosophy, and maybe to what extent has that changed as you've served on many different leadership levels throughout the years?
Yeah, I think so. I've always thought about it as I think I've always fit, even though I didn't maybe know it early on what it was called, that I've always tried to be a little bit of a servant leader and just lead by example. Don't ask my team to do things that I'm not willing to do. Um, and, being vulnerable, showing up for people, and not being afraid to admit when you're wrong, I guess, I think is a key takeaway there in terms of leading by example. So I guess the way I would define it is, to me, leadership is motivating and aligning people to move in the direction of a shared vision. And a shared vision has been critical to a lot of the work that I've done. I love to kind of build a team that has a shared vision, to build that collaboratively. And then once we've got that vision and we're clear on where we're going, then empower people to go after it and to make decisions and to get things done. If they run into obstacles, if you run into hurdles, you need help, let me know. But otherwise, where we're going, we're aligned on priorities, go make it happen.
So many key words that you said there that I want to touch on. I interpret that, Ed, as you have a strong grasp and idea on how you build culture, because you talked about establishing the vision, holding people accountable. So how do you go about, or how have you gone about, even as an internal candidate? Every time we switch roles, we are in a new culture, a new environment.
Yeah.
What are some things that you might want to share for some of our newer leaders or experienced leaders about how do you go about developing that team and that culture?
I think it starts, to me, it always comes back to people. It's about relationships. And so to me, it really starts with listening, with taking time to listen and get to know people. When I became an associate dean, even though I had been at the school for a long time, I didn't know the other chairs. They didn't know me. I was, again, pretty junior. So I probably did a little bit more of coming in trying to know all the answers than I should have. I wish I would have spent a little bit more time listening. So by the time I got tasked to lead this new college, I knew a lot of those folks, but they didn't all know me as the dean. They knew me as Ed or that, and trying to understand who these folks were, where they were coming from, what they had experienced during a reduction in force, during the pandemic, when so many of us were dealing with so much stuff, and came to understand very quickly that even on our own campus, the culture between student affairs and academic affairs was very, very different, and how we did meetings and how we made decisions. And I had to adjust a lot of my own approach to doing things in order to account for that and build that team. coming into Oshkosh, it's been very different because I didn't know anybody here, and nobody here knew me as Ed. They just know me as the provost. And so, under a normal situation, I would have come in and tried to do a listening tour and really spend my time getting to know people. But we had some pretty immediate challenges we needed to deal with. And so, I had to do kind of a quick diagnosis of where we were going here. But it's still ultimately about people and about culture. And so wherever I can, I'm still trying to reach back out to folks, find time to find out how they're doing, what's going on, get their informal input on stuff, as well as, the more structure we have from the deans, from chairs, from shared governance partners, that kind of stuff, so that I can try as best I can to establish that sense of trust and get them to come with me, as we had to make are having to make some really quick and some pretty tough decisions. And there's not always time for us to get to know each other super well, but it was important for me to still come in and try to establish a little bit of trust and ultimately get them to at least trust that they could hold me accountable as I was going to make decisions.
So, along those lines, I always like to ask people this because anyone that gets into a leadership role or maybe doesn't want to get into it, addressing conflict always comes up. Either it's a concern, people don't want to. Obviously, the teams you have led, the jobs you have had, I know that that has been something you have had to address. So, talk about how you go about that and advice you would have to leaders about addressing conflict.
I would say for folks who are especially coming up through the traditional faculty route, through department leadership and college leadership, it's by and large, and I found this to be pretty consistently true, the part of the job for which we are least prepared, least trained and developed. We're just not trained to manage people, to do personnel, to do things like performance management. And so dealing with people, I mean, it's, some of us learn that in faculty meetings and curriculum committees and things like that. But when you have to supervise faculty and staff and navigate things across units, that's a whole different ballgame. And so this is one that I'm a big believer in intentional professional development and training for folks who are thinking they might want to do this. And some institutions do this pretty well. Some of them, I think, are figuring out new ways to do it. But this is one that I would certainly advocate for and encourage people who are thinking about it to seek out. If you have internal programs at your institution, take advantage of that. Dip your toes in the water. Find out if you want to be a chair or thinking about an administrative path, and don't be afraid to then ask questions, to do some job shadowing, to seek out a mentor. And particularly on this piece of how do we manage people, how do we manage conflict, how do we do things like performance management for staff who are struggling. And then when it comes time to actually have the hard conversations, I think there's a whole nother set of strategies around that really require training and development, and really then ultimately practice, really going into conversations, are going to be hard with intention, certainly with empathy, trying to understand where the other person is going for. And then also having a sense of what do you want the outcome of the meeting to be? I mean, these are things that it's important to plan for, just like you would plan for an important strategic planning meeting or an important conference presentation. You would practice, you would maybe do a dry run with somebody, you would get yourself into a good mental space beforehand and really think about how you're going into it, how the other person might be feeling, and ultimately what you want to get out of that conversation.
I'm glad you mentioned doing a dry run. It sounds like you have had some good mentors. I've been fortunate. And one of the things I learned early on when I became a chair was the value with a trusted mentor of doing those role playing what you anticipate might be a difficult conversation. And the first time I did it, it feels a little awkward, but just same reason that sports teams practice and we get reps, and it might still feel uncomfortable, but we feel a little bit better. And so I'm glad you brought that up, because I always encourage folks within reason, don't violate confidentiality, but I think maybe have one or two mentors, maybe they aren't on your campus, that you can do a dry run and say, I'm going to be my role, you're going to be the other person, here's a general scenario. So also, Ed, if you could, I like to ask people your first official leadership title in higher education, when you made that official move from full-time faculty to whether it was chair or associate dean, if you could go back and give that leader some advice, what would you say?
So I think the first, I became associate chair, but that was really still primarily a faculty job with a little release time added to it. So I think it was really associate dean of College of Arts and Sciences, our biggest college at the time. And I had a big portfolio and was supervising staff suddenly, which I had never really done before, and coordinating all sorts of things for 26 different college, schools and departments. And as I mentioned earlier, I think one of my mistakes and things that I would have thought about differently was I I wish I would have come into it being willing to be more vulnerable and just, I think I did an okay job of listening, but I don't think I could have ever done enough. Being willing to go in, ask questions, admit when you don't know the answers or you don't know exactly how to attack a particular problem. I felt like being pretty young, pretty junior, I felt like I needed to come in guns blazing. And, that led me to make a couple strategic errors, nothing catastrophic. But I would certainly encourage people to, you have to be authentic, but to be willing to be vulnerable and admit what you don't know and not be afraid to ask for help and ask for questions is really only going to pay off for your own leadership development, but it's probably going to endear you to your team and your colleagues as well.
So as a provost, somebody who obviously hires, like we said before, deans, assistant deans, associate, what are some things from your perspective that you are looking for in department chairs?
I think people, it's a challenging time to be a leader coming out of the pandemic. In higher ed right now, it's such a competitive, challenging landscape, especially in politically divided states and public institutions that are dependent upon state funding. That folks who can get on board with a vision, but then go execute, and who can lead, who can help execute the shared vision that you're going to run into obstacles. It could be with faculty, it could be with staff, could be with students. But certainly folks who are willing to put themselves out there and say, I'm willing to step up and lead. And not because, I think this is another important point, not because I want to be an administrator or I want more money. There's folks out there who want to do those things for that reason. And that's always to me a red flag. I want to know, what are you passionate about when it comes to higher education? What are you passionate about when it comes to leadership? And it's got to eventually come back to some larger mission, vision about the people or something. Because folks who want to be an administrator for the sake of being an administrator, for the power, the money, whatever, for the title, for the next step in a career, whatever that might be, that to me is usually a red flag. I want to know that you're passionate about the vision and the people.
I think that's important. In a previous podcast and in my book on department chair leadership, I call those the foolish four. And one of those is for just the title or the power, that wears off in the reality pretty quickly.
Yep.
And the only thing more expensive than a good leader is a bad one. People, all leaders at any level, whether you're an NFL football coach or whatever, they earn their money. And so I'm glad you mentioned that. So what I would like to do then, just the final three questions here as we close out. What are you currently doing, planning to do, or hope to do to improve yourself as a leader?
So I would say three things, all of which are various versions of asking for help and not being afraid to do that, to go back to what we talked earlier. I was encouraged by folks and was initially reluctant, but to hire a sort of a professional executive coach who's been an academic leader, been a president, and so has some sense of what's involved in the job. That's been valuable. I've been part of a new provost academy through ASCU, which has been great, and it's helped me find a community of also brand new provosts. And it's hard to find folks who understand what it's like to provost every day and to be able to kind of share and commiserate with them. So we've only met a few times at this point, but it's been a great group, that one. And then the third one is this will be still to come in the next couple of months, but doing a 360 review here and actively promoting the solicitation of feedback for my performance as provost on campus. As I'm still trying to get to know everybody here, I'm trying to get actual input that can help improve my performance as provost. What's working, what's not, what would you like to see more of? But I think it's also, we don't have a culture necessarily of that at this institution. And so I'm also trying to use it as a chance to model that we want feedback. We want to be able to weigh in on each other's performance and hold each other accountable. And there's a way to do that in a way that shouldn't be simply punitive. It should be as a way for us to continue developing as leaders and get that honest feedback from our team, from the campus community, from our colleagues.
If you were forced, I should say, busy life of a provost you might have to be, to take a free day to do whatever you wanted, and it could not in any way involve working as a provost, what would you do?
No work at all. That would be something. I'm a pretty simple guy at the end of the day. My interests have been the same for a long time. I love to read, I love music, I love sports. So if I could combine some of those, as I'm occasionally able to do on a Sunday, spend some time with my family, maybe watch a ball game. And then I always love to read. I'm always trying to read at least one fiction and one nonfiction book at the same time. Right now that's a challenge, but trying to get back into the groove. And then I love to listen to music and love to play music as well. And so finding a little bit of time to do a little bit of that on a nice Sunday afternoon would be a great day.
Awesome. And then finally, just any bits of advice or words of wisdom for our chairs, directors, other mid-level positions in higher education who want to improve their organizations by improving themselves as leaders?
I think the big one, this is going to sound repetitive at this point, but being honest with yourself about where you're at, what you want, what kinds of opportunities are you looking for? What kind of challenges are you willing to take on? Because it's hard work. Being a dean, being a chair is, I should have said this earlier, given the title of your show, but it is the toughest and most thankless job on campus. Provost is right there, but department chair is really universally challenging. So you got to be thinking about what do you really want to get out of it and what are you hoping to do? And then if you're interested in that, more sustained leadership path, that's where I think it comes into getting honest assessments, asking for feedback, but then also asking for help and not being afraid to raise your hand and say, I'm interested in doing this, but I would like a little guidance, a little bit structure, seeking out those leadership institutes or those internal development programs. And also that it's okay not to want to do that stuff too. I know lots of folks who had this vision of I'm going to be a dean and I'm going to be a provost and all this stuff. And boy, a year into the deal as department chair or even associate chair, decided this is absolutely not for me, that's okay. Being a faculty member is a great job. It's a great gig. It's fun work. It's rewarding work. It's hard work, but that's okay too. So, I think it's really important for people to be honest with themselves and not tie that it's still at the end of the day, it's a job. It's not who you are.
Very, very powerful advice to end on is I do think sometimes we might get in this career track minded that progressive steps from the chair on up, and we almost overlook the fact that I do think one of the best jobs on a college campus, certainly on the academic side of the fence, is being a professor and working with students and pursuing your research passion and all of the things that faculty members get to do. That's a great gig as well. Thank you for joining us today. And I thank our listeners for once again joining us on the Department Chair Leadership Podcast. I wish you well, and I'll see you next time. Thank you for listening to the Department Chair Leadership Podcast. If you want to learn more about my leadership philosophy and how to be an effective chair, please consider my book, The Department Chair, A Practical Guide to Effective Leadership. You can find this and learn more about me by going to cjleadership.com. Also, please be sure to like this podcast, leave a review, and share with your colleagues. Thanks again for improving your organization and those you serve by improving yourself. Take care.